Hello and welcome to Bloke on the Range. This is finally episode 8 of the Swiss Straight Pull Rifle series, and I apologise for the long gap, but life's been a bit hectic. That's how it is. Also, I make no apologies for working from notes for this one, so I don't have any of the rifles at hand. I don't even have pictures of some of the rifles we're going to talk about. I'm going to do my best with the information that I've got. So what we're going to do is talk about the trials that led to the transition from the GP90 round nose funky paper patch oddity to the GP11 era, and these were carried out in the sort of 1908-1909 time frame. State of play. So we are at the end of the GP90 era, and I say at the end, I mean, okay, the end for frontline infantry, because this is going to survive in service in rear line, third line, Landsturm troops until the 1930s, and will reappear again during World War II with the Ortswehr, the sort of local defence volunteers. So the state of play around 1906 is that we've got the infantry having a mixture of Model 1889 rifles, Model 89/96 rifles, depending on when they entered service, because you got what you got, they didn't get replaced. There's no like, oh, this is new and shiny, swap over. No, they were treated as basically equivalent. The cavalry are busy transitioning from the 1893 Mannlicher carbine to the Model 1905. The cycle troops, artillery, fortress troops, some engineers have the Model 1900 short rifle, which is kind of my favourite of the series, and I actually got to fire one in an earlier video, which was pretty cool. As I said, they're all on this. When this was adopted, this was on the curve. I mean, this is a sort of 212 grain bullet doing about 1800 feet per second. It's similar to most things, aside from, say, or the Austrian 1895 Mannlicher was firing a much heavier bullet. What's happened in the meantime, though, is in 1898 the French have got ahead of the curve on everybody, and they've introduced a monolith boat-tail Spitzer, the Balle D, into service, still with that horrible double-tapered 8mm Lebel case, but ballistically they're ahead of the curve. There'd already been some experiments in the 1890s in the US in this direction, but nothing came of them. It was really in 1903 when the Germans adopted a Spitzer, the S-Geschoss, Spitzgeschoss, pointy bullet, literally, that everyone started to take notice. Then you end up with 30.06 in the States, and everyone else sort of rushes over a period of about 10 years or so to adopt a Spitzer. And this is where the Swiss come in. Also, as early as 1903, people have been pointing out that these rifles were pretty heavy, and it was kind of time to take all of this in one go and sort it out. So as early as 1903, again, same year, they were noting that this was starting to get a bit behind the curve, and so it was about the right time. So from 1905 onwards, our friend Schmidt-Rubin, the manager of the Federal Ammunition Plant in Thun, was starting to play around with that. Now, a quick little tangent. We love our tangents here at Bloke on the Range. The advantages of a flatter flying bullet. Just to give an example of how much of a rainbow trajectory this thing has compared to what's considered normal today. If you're shooting one of these rifles at 300 meters with the sight set at 300, in principle it should be going point of aim, point of impact. You move the sights to 400, only a little movement, but that moves the point of impact by about a meter. So by modern standards, this is rainbows. At the time of the adoption, previously things were running at sort of 1400, 1500, 1600 feet per second. So this was a laser beam compared to then, but this is a laser beam compared to that. And then modern small bore cartridges like 223 Remington are a laser beam compared to that. Now the advantage of this is that if you make an error in range adjustment, you're more likely to still hit what you're aiming at, because the bullet's flying flatter. The dangerous zone, which is basically anywhere a bullet can fly, is longer. It's stretched out. It doesn't matter. I mean, just to put it in perspective, if you've got an enemy at 300 meters and you think they're at 400 and you're set at 400, you're aiming center of mass, a meter is over their head. Now, if the difference between 300 and 400 is only 30 centimeters, they're still in the dangerous zone. But with the old cartridge, with that error, you're actually shooting over their heads. And the further out you get, the worse this gets. So anyway, this is why it was seen as a massive advantage to have a flatter flying bullet. And sorry, that was a very, very long tangent. Back at the plot. So, as I said, from 1905 onwards, Schmidt-Rubin is mucking around with these things. And the first one of note that we get to is the VP07, the Versuchspatrone 1907, the experimental cartridge. Now, this is very similar to the German Essgeschoss and very similar to the 3006 bullet. In this case, it's a 10 gram, which is 154 grain Spitzer flat base. Now, on the 9th of December 1907, the Waffenfabrik Bern gets the order to produce the first test series that we're going to talk about. So there were 50 rifles with ordnance barrels and cartridges, so that's these like this. 50 rifles with ordnance barrels and ordnance cartridges with a recut chamber. Oops. 50 rifles with ordnance barrels and new cartridges with a recut chamber. And 50 rifles with new barrels and new cartridges. And we don't actually have any pictures even of these rifles. Now, the reason for doing these all these variants was, first of all, it was doing some science, so we're going to change one thing at a time. It was thought that it would be really advantageous to have sort of compatibility with ammo, so that at least the older rifles could be like have the chamber re-reamed and shoot both types of ammunition. There's even talk of a sight with graduations that apply for both, but that's physically not possible unless you're going to do something complicated and have two different scales. I think the people who were writing these reports didn't fully grasp what was going on that point. From a cost perspective, it's best to do minimal changes. So in an ideal case, it would have been great if they could have just taken these, re-reamed the chamber, stick a new sight on for the new ammunition, and good. Or a new sight with two sets of graduations, whatever. Now, at least the last set of 50 rifles seem to have had a lot of the changes that then appear on the 1911 rifles. It's not clear whether any of the others were modified in this way or not, but at least the last one seemed to have had a flat butt plate, a pistol grip like the 1905 carbine, more modern post sights, because we're on barleycorns right now, and barleycorns compared to a rectangular post are quite horrible. A lighter stock and a 6-round magazine. I said the others just haven't got the information. Reason for the 6-round magazine, actually, we have solved this mystery. It was simply for lightness. Ultimately, the rifles that weren't converted, they left them with the 12-round magazine because there was no point from a cost perspective to change that for older, more rear echelon troops. And yeah, so that's where the 6-round magazine comes from. They also tested a couple of rifle supports called Moser and Brechtbühl. Again, no information, but these were not popular with the instructors. It was just a big embuggerance to carry around, and they were dropped. So on the 14th of July 1908, the Rifle Commission informed the military department of the results of the tests, and they were impressed with the new ammunition, and they wanted the pistol grip on all the rifles. At this time, they were still talking in terms of having a long rifle, a short rifle, and a proper carbine. The proper carbine had the pistol grip already, so they were talking about retrofitting these to the short rifles as well, and to the long rifles, which they ultimately did, and we'll get on to another time. The tests also showed that the new cartridge didn't shoot adequately in the modified rifles. It really needed a new barrel. I mean, tangent again, this thing is a very special, unique thing, and the chamber in here, the throat, is very, very long because this is an extremely fat bullet. Including the patch, it runs about 321 in inches, and that's squeezed down to anywhere down to about 0.303 on the lands there. Very special. So the more conventional bullets didn't really work. There's a rattling good fit in that long throat and didn't go anywhere. The accuracy with the modified rifles was adequate for sort of grouped fire, but the shooting clubs weren't happy with it, of course. The shooting club lobby is kind of powerful here, and frankly, having shot privy bullets in these chambers, yeah, I can see that. It's kind of fussy. It's a very fine line between it being fine, and I shot this particular rifle at 300 and came second in a competition with it at 300. But you make a slight change and it starts to yaw, and all sorts of horrible things happen. So that was the first phase of the trials done. Then in January 1909, the Federal Council approved the production of 900 rifles and 100 short rifles and 100 carbines to what are now known as the '08 trials versions, together with the new ammunition, VP08. And this is a 175 grain boat tail, FMJ boat tail at about 2,500, 2,550 feet per second, and is basically just taken over into GP11. I don't believe they made any changes between the 1908 ammunition and the first generation of GP11. The rifles and carbines themselves look very similar to the later 1911 series, so there's not a lot to say there. The major differences were that the underside of the rear sight was scaled, a Grabenvisier, a trench sight, so that you could leave the rifle on the top of the trench and be under cover and lift up the leaf and adjust it. The magazine is still that from the 1900 short rifles and the 1905 carbines, with the belt, and there were 3 lightning cuts put in the bolt sleeve. As far as the long rifles concerned, it seems that these were the same as the last 50 of the first tranche, as far as we know. Don't quote me on that. I mean, literally, we don't have any information on exactly what the first 200 trials rifles were. Now, the rifles were actually tested with both 270mm and 230mm twist barrels, and they settled on the latter, which was a mistake. And then very early on in production of the 1911 series, they actually went back to 270mm. So as for the short rifle, this was basically a 1900 short rifle, sling on the bottom, and set up with a new barrel for the new ammunition and with new sights. And I have a converted model 1900 short rifle here to K11 configuration. So this is a model 00/11. And the only fundamental differences with the short rifle was the short rifle had an unprotected front sight set further back, similar sights, sling on the bottom like a rifle rather than on the side like a carbine. And that's it. Basically, they're the same length. The official reason for dropping it was that the sight line was 3.5 centimeters shorter. And this is often misreported. A little tangent here. The term they used was Anschlaglinie, which is normally used as to mean length of pull. Anschlag can be length of pull, but Anschlagen is to aim. So someone somewhere used the term Anschlaglinie to mean sight line, and other people interpreted it as length of pull, which is how far the trigger is from the butt plate. But anyway, in any case, it would have been totally pointless to have 2 almost identical rifles, and these are more robust simply by virtue of having the protected front sight. So parallel to all of this, they were looking at all sorts of other designs, both bolt actions and semi-autos. There were no suitable semi-autos. I mean, we get into the 30s before we start getting to practical semi-autos. I mean, they'd been round the corner since like the 1890s, but nothing happened. Fundamentally, a change in system to something else wasn't really going to happen because they're very cost conscious. Switzerland was not a rich country at the time. And you'll see when we talk about the conversion program that they're desperately trying to minimize cost. So after a few minor trials to iron out the fine details, we end up with a plan to convert these to Model 96/11s, to convert all of the carbines and short rifles into these, and to manufacture new rifles to the new pattern. I'll explain all the differences in those and the whys and wherefores when we deal with those another time. The 1889 rifles were deemed not strong enough to be fed a steady diet of the new ammunition, so they were left as they were with the old cartridge. Now, what happens to a lot of these rifles? They do turn up occasionally. There's a couple of the short rifles in museums, but they're extremely rare. The '08 carbines do tend to turn up. A lot of them seem to have gone to Freiburg Cantonal Police. They're very, very expensive when they come up. The rifles do turn up occasionally. I mean, last time I saw any come up was about 4 years ago, and they were well over 2,000 francs, which is quite a lot. I suppose these days there'd probably be even more. And as for the rest, there's not really much of a record of what went on. Some were presumably converted, some would have been sold off. I mean, as I say, they do turn up occasionally. Now, but for me, the most interesting part of this is a bit of a mystery. Now, if you've been wondering what this has been the whole time, They also trialled a Mauser type stripper clip, and if you'll let me bring myself around to the camera, I will talk about that. So as I'm sure you're aware, the Swiss rifles use these funky sort of treated rigid cardboard and tin chargers, which are actually pretty slick. And just a little example, this is an original one for GP90, which only has one reinforcing rim, and this is one for GP11 later with two. Now, as early as 1903, this date keeps coming up a lot in this video, I'm sorry, there was a gentleman high in the hierarchy who was pointing out that maybe we should look at something a bit more Mauser-like, metal, because I'm sure that when these get soggy and damp, that they ultimately fall apart, which is probably less optimal. I mean, the ammunition was packaged in wax paper, so it should have been mostly protected from the elements, but once it's in the pouches, if they get soaked through, I'm sure these go soft. So they actually packaged the ammunition for the trials, at least with the VP08, so the Spitzer boat tail that became GP11. They packaged them in what are known as DM Lader. And if you see there, you see the little manufacturer's mark DM. Now this turns up on German Mauser 98 stripper clips as well. And just to give you an idea of the size difference, this is a German one for 8x57, and these are massive. And it's not just the fact that they take 6 rounds and that these have got bigger bases than 8mm Mauser, but they are very wide. And as a result, all the trials rifles and all the rifles from then on have charger guide notches in the top there. I mean, right up to and including the ZFK55. They're all fitted for these. So this then works like any Mauser type stripper clip, and it will self-eject, which is cool. These are of course dummies. They are Manipulierpatronen, and I'm at a terrible angle here, and this rifle's actually kind of stiff. So yeah, now there's literally no documentation as to why these things weren't adopted, and apparently they also turned up later on some of the 1930s intermediate cartridge trials as well. But we have to ask ourselves why. We have to work out from first principles why these things were not adopted. I think there's two reasons. The first of which is economic, because by the time these, by the time of the trials, all the plant for making these will have been basically amortized and paid off. So there's got to be a value add to want to change to something new. I mean, clearly these were made in Germany by DM, so they'd have had to buy new tooling, fresh tooling, to make these. They'd have then had for a long time 2 types of ammunition in the system, ammunition packaged in these and ammunition packaged in these. This brings up to the next point. So the next point is how ammunition was carried on the belt, and it was carried in pouches like this. Unfortunately, these clips won't go in, these pouches are a bit tight. 12 in each, 24 total, carried horizontally so that you can pull on the top round and pull it out. The question is, okay, let's put them in like that, open the pouch, and okay, so that doesn't work. So let's put that back in. So we're going to put them in vertically. Well, they don't really fit. They're kind of, I wish I had 2 of these clips, but I don't. But they don't really fit. They'd have to be carried in that way. And then, okay, so we've taken one out. We've got one in there, and it's a rattling good fit. I'm running around. And, well, when I practiced this, it worked. Anyway, there was a risk of losing rounds. As usual, as soon as the camera's running, something goes wrong. But that's a rattling good fit. Now, these are extremely strongly made, and you probably have to change the design a bit to work properly with these. So they'd be narrower in that dimension and wider in that dimension, so that the clips fit in properly. But in the meantime, then you probably have two types of pouches, one of which would sort of work with these, but not really, and another which wouldn't work with these at all because they need the length to get in there. And then fundamentally, having played with these on the range a bit, they're less slick. These do strip in a lot easier. Automatic eject doesn't really matter because you can just flick it out with your thumb. So ultimately, they didn't adopt them. And in the sources I've got, there is no reason given for this. In the various what's it called in English? The Berichte, the reports. There's no mention of these clips at all. What I would like to do at some point is dig through the Federal Archives and see if I can find any reason why these funky things were not adopted, and why it just became standard to have these notches on everything since, just in case. But that's a little mystery. I like it. Your mileage may vary. So I hope that was at least vaguely interesting and not too droning and boring as usual. Thank you very much for watching this far. Thank you very much to patrons whose generosity keeps the channel ticking along. And if you haven't become a patron, please consider doing so, and see you again sometime. Bye.